In the heart of Pennsylvania, among the dense forests, there is a place that has become a symbol of danger and oblivion. Centralia is a town that one day simply disappeared from the map of the United States. And although today this place looks like a scene from a horror movie, its history is much more mystical than you might imagine. What was the reason for this mysterious fate of the city? And why did the people who stayed behind start to be called living ghosts? Let's find out why Centralia ceased to exist and why it is still visited by researchers and tourists. Centralia was founded in the mid-19th century and quickly gained prominence due to its rich mines that supplied coal for the entire country. The city prospered, and joy and laughter rang through its streets. However, all that changed in the mid-1960s when a fire broke out in mine number 13, located under the city, and it continues to burn to this day. This fire was probably caused by carelessly left garbage fires, which, penetrating the underground tunnels, ignited the minefields. Initially, it seemed like a minor problem, but it quickly spread, taking over more and more territory. Local authorities did not realize the scale of the disaster at first, and when the fire became uncontrollable, it was too late. The fire not only destroyed the mines, but also created deadly conditions for the residents: underground gases, rising temperatures, and air that became unbreathable. Story 1. One of the most famous legends about Centralia tells of the Goodman family, who did not want to leave their town even when everything around them began to collapse. According to eyewitnesses, after they were evacuated, local researchers began to hear strange sounds, as if someone was knocking on the old door of their house. One day, a group of researchers went to the Goodmans' abandoned house, and when they went inside, they saw old furniture moving around the rooms by itself, and a fire that left no trace glowing in the fireplace. This happened at the exact moment when the family was evacuated, and no one else saw them alive. Story 2. The second story concerns a young man named Jim, who stayed in Centralia after the evacuation, hoping that the situation would eventually stabilize. According to local hunters, one day they saw Jim near the forest, moving without a sound, as if he were appearing out of the fog. However, when they approached, he disappeared so quickly that it seemed as if he had been swallowed up by the earth. Legend has it that Jim became a part of this place. His spirit now hovers over Centralia, despite the fact that he died back in the 80s. Hunters even say that at night, they can hear him whispering his name softly to the wind. By the late 1970s, numerous attempts to extinguish the fire had failed. Thousands of residents were evacuated, and Centralia itself was declared uninhabitable. The city, once home to over 2,000 people, was a wasteland. But that's not all. While most people left the city, a few families stayed behind, hoping that things would eventually return to normal. However, the gases released from the ground continued to keep any hope of recovery at bay. Now, almost 50 years after the tragedy, Centralia remains one of the most dangerous and mysterious places on Earth. Story 3. The last story is about a group of tourists who decided to spend the night in Centralia. They found mysterious footprints on one of the streets that led to a forgotten old cafe. It was cold inside, and although everything around them looked empty, one of the tourists felt that someone was watching him. When he turned to look, he saw a man in a gray suit in one of the windows looking at him. But when they got closer, he vanished into thin air. Their story has become one of the most discussed among paranormal enthusiasts. Legends and theories about ghosts roaming the abandoned streets have become an integral part of the history of this ghost town. Are they real? Many believe that it is because of this catastrophic fate that this place has become a home for souls that have not found peace. Story 4. In 1991, a group of local teenagers traveled to Centralia, wanting to see the ghost town. They reached the old fire station, which, according to legend, was the site of the city's last battle with the fire that never stopped. One of the girls, Katie, went inside and noticed old fire helmets lying on the floor. When she picked one up, she suddenly heard a scream from behind her. Katie turned around, but there was no one there. All her friends at that moment heard an incomprehensible voice whispering softly, "Don't leave us." A few minutes later, they left the station in a hurry, but Katie could never forget that voice. Since then, every time she visited the forest near Centralia, she thought she heard the same whisper.
Story 5. Another story is related to a strange mystery that could not be solved even after many years. One day, when people were still alive in Centralia, the Taylor family noticed that their houses began to return to their old appearance, even though they had not spent any money on repairs. Old furniture began to appear in place of new ones, and windows were being boarded up again, even though they had been broken long ago. One day, the family's mother saw an old, unknown photo of her grandmother appear in their kitchen, showing her standing in front of a house that had never been theirs. When they tried to ask their neighbors, it turned out that they had also seen the photos. This gave rise to numerous theories that the souls of the deceased residents of Centralia are trying to bring back their descendants by forcing them to return to these forgotten places. Story 6. Not so long ago, in 2000, several tourists visiting Centralia came across a place that had never been marked on any map. It was an old square that seemed to exist in another dimension. When they got inside, they saw a strange world where time seemed to have stopped. All the trees were covered with green mosses, and a bright red sun was hanging in the sky. In the center of the square stood a huge stone obelisk, around which there was a very quiet whisper. Each of the tourists had a feeling that someone was waiting for them, but they did not understand who it was. After returning, they could not remember how they left the place, only the memory of how they made their way through the thick fog. And when they returned home, they all had the same dreams. They saw themselves as children walking in the same park, among the green trees and the red sun, where it was never dark. Story 7. The last story belongs to a group of archaeologists who went to Centralia in 2010, hoping to uncover all the secrets of the city. They explored old burials, excavations near abandoned houses and mines. However, while excavating one of the graves that was supposed to be empty, they came across a strange artifact, an old clock without hands that suddenly started working. All the archaeologists were shocked because this clock had no mechanism for moving the hands, but suddenly began to count down the time. After that, each of the researchers began to have terrible nightmares in which time never moved, and they were constantly stuck in the past. They returned to Centralia several times, trying to understand what this phenomenon was, but were unable to find an answer. Since then, the clock has been lost, but everyone who has seen it believes that it has the power to freeze time. Story 8. After most of the residents of Centralia fled because of the danger, one family stayed behind, believing their home would remain safe. Only a few weeks later, they began to notice strange things. Doors that had never been locked were opening every time, and furniture seemed to move by itself. At night, They began to hear heavy footsteps in the corridors, even though the house was empty. The worst thing happened one fierce winter night. The mother of the family went to the cellar and saw an old photograph of her mother in the same house, although she had never lived there. When she went upstairs, she saw the door on the second floor suddenly close. She heard a familiar voice, the voice of her dead mother, slowly repeating, "Don't leave me." In the morning, when the family went to the local doctor, they learned that her mother had died several years ago, but her shadow still remained within these walls. Story 9. A man who moved to Centralia in the early 80s decided to return to his home after a long absence to see what was left of his possessions. His house did not look empty, but it was cold and strange inside. All his belongings that he had left behind had disappeared without a trace. Instead, there were strange footprints and old furniture he had never seen before. But when he approached the old mirror in the hallway, his reflection suddenly changed. He saw himself as he had been a few years ago, and several other ghosts standing next to him in the shadows. Those ghosts were not strangers. They were his mother and father, who had died long ago, but their shadows were tied to this house. As he looked into their eyes, he felt a coldness gradually envelop his body. It was only when he ran away that the mirror became normal, and the ghosts disappeared.
Story 10. A group of young people who liked to travel to abandoned cities went to Centralia to make a video about forgotten houses. They came across one of the houses that looked completely different from the others. All the walls were covered with strange drawings, and there were old, rusty tools on the floor. In one of the rooms, there was a large wooden chair that seemed to have been in use recently. However, when one of the boys sat down on it, the room suddenly went dark, and he felt arms wrapped tightly around him, as if someone invisible was trying to hold him down. Everyone ran for the exit, but dark figures appeared in the doorway, blocking their way. Only when they cried out in fear did these figures disappear, leaving behind the unpleasant smell of old liquid. After that, none of them dared to return to Centralia. Story 11. After a night in Centralia, a group of tourists headed home, but each of them began to notice something unusual. All the clocks in their bags stopped at exactly 3:03 a.m., and it wasn't just an anomaly. Time had stopped. They found themselves in a dark fog where nothing was visible but a thick mist. It felt as if they were in another dimension. Whispers were heard in everyone's head, and ghostly figures came out of the darkness and just stood there, looking at them with empty eyes. When one of the tourists approached one of them, the ghost said, "You are not going home." In a moment, it disappeared, leaving behind only an eerie silence. It was only when they reached the exit that the watches started working again, but they were all convinced that this moment and their watches had been stolen by that invisible force. Story 12. Another man staying in Centralia for a few nights decided to explore an unknown neighborhood. He came across an old abandoned street with a huge house with a slanted roof. When he went inside, he found old photographs on the walls showing his ancestors, people he had never met. However, when he approached one of the photos, it changed its appearance, and he appeared standing next to a woman he had never met. At that moment, he heard a voice from the other room. "You have always been here." When he turned around, he saw his mother again, who said, "Don't look for me. You are already part of us." That man never returned to Centralia again. Story 13. A young man who liked to make videos about abandoned places came to Centralia in the middle of the fall. That's when he came across an old factory that had been abandoned for years. He went inside and noticed that all the windows were boarded up. As soon as he took his first steps in the corridor, he heard the sound of an old mechanism starting to work. In one of the rooms, there was a strange light coming from old lamps. He walked in and saw the whole house seem to come to life. The walls started moving, and the old doors opened and closed by themselves. At that moment, shadows began to emerge from every corner, watching his every move. Those shadows were not alive. They were human outlines, without faces. To escape, he ran for the exit, but his every step echoed in the empty silence, as if they were trapped. Story 14. A group of archaeology students went to Centralia to explore old burials. They found an ancient cemetery that no one had visited for many years. Among the graves, they found an old stone obelisk with unidentifiable markings. When one of them touched it, black vapors began to rise from the ground and surrounded the entire group. The more they tried to clean the marks, the more strange sounds arose, as if fire was bursting from the ground. Then, faces appeared, ugly, black, looking at them in surprise, silently whispering curses. The group fled, but at home, each of them began to receive letters that read, "You woke us up." Story 15. On the night of January 1st one year, everything in Centralia fell silent. People felt like the whole world was quiet and time had stopped. The whole city became empty and dark, and when they tried to leave their homes, they found themselves in an endless circle. All the streets seemed the same, and those who walked along them could not find a way out. Those who stayed in the city began to hear unfamiliar voices whispering about old sins and how this time was created to take revenge on those who left the city. Every hour brought new horrors, and what had been a day of celebration became a nightmare. Story 16. In 2006, a couple of tourists stayed overnight in Centralia to capture the atmosphere of the ghost town. At night, they felt a strong cloud of mysterious cold as their tent was surrounded by shadows. They had the feeling that they were being watched. They tried to go to the nearest village, but an old van appeared in their path, standing in the middle of the road. As they approached, they could only see the shadows of people watching them from the windows. But their eyes were empty and their faces showed no emotion. Only when they ran away from the place, hearing terrifying screams, did the van disappear, and there was only silence around. Story 17. Once a tourist went missing in Centralia, who went for a walk in the forest. He got lost among the trees and began to follow the strange voices calling him on. He made his way through the dense forest, but the further he went, the darker the forest became. Suddenly, the trees began to move, and human shadows began to emerge from the thicket, following him. His every move was repeated, as if he were trapped. Eventually, he got so deeply lost that he found himself in an unfamiliar clearing, and only there did he see strange symbols on stones that belonged to an ancient cult. Story 18. One day in Centralia, a mysterious traveler came through the city and got lost among its ruins. He entered one of the houses that remained in surprisingly good condition, but heard an unexplained noise, as if someone was struggling inside. Quite unexpectedly, an old woman who looked like a resident of the city appeared from somewhere and asked him to leave the place, because there is no place for those who are not from our time. The traveler didn't listen to her, and the next day, something terrible happened to him. He began to forget all his memories of life. With each new day, he loses a part of himself, his memory, his ability to speak, and then his body, until he becomes part of the very city he is guarding. Story 19. In 1999, a group of archaeologists came to Centralia to explore the remains of old houses and graves. One day, they came across an unusual cave that led deep underground. Pleased with the discovery, they decided to explore it. But the further they went, the more they felt that the cave was moving and turning into a labyrinth that was changing itself. On the walls, they saw scary drawings depicting people dissolving in the darkness. As soon as they reached the end, One of them came across a mysterious stone slab that began to glow, and then everyone realized that they were trapped. When one of them tried to go back, he disappeared, and the rest of them were left with the wind whistling and screaming in the fog. Story 20. During an expedition to Centralia, an explorer came across an old church covered with moss and vines. When he went inside, he heard the plaintive sound of the organ playing by itself. Suddenly, the lights went out, and he realized that he was surrounded by a strange cold feeling, as if time had frozen here. The man walked up to the altar and saw a strange image on the wall that looked like a person who had been burned while alive. And just then, a figure came out of the corner and slowly approached him. It had no face, but with each step, its shape changed. Its movements were cold, and its eyes reflected the researcher himself. Suddenly, he began to feel strange. His mind began to get confused, and he heard terrible words. "You will also become a part of us." Story 21. In the mid-1980s, a man who failed to leave the Central Committee during the evacuation experienced a horrific event. He got lost among the empty streets and entered a house that looked new. However, when he went inside, he realized that the time was not the same as in the real world. All the windows were closed, and the lighting flickered strangely. In the shadows, he saw several silhouettes sitting and staring at him in silence. Once, when he got closer, one of the silhouettes suddenly grabbed his arm and whispered, "You are not the first and not the last. You will stay here forever." The man tried to escape, but the door would not open, and the forces surrounding him grew stronger. No one has seen him since then. Story 22. A few years ago, a group of young people decided to spend a night in an abandoned building in Centralia, making a documentary. They chose the most abandoned house on the outskirts of the city. As soon as they entered, they began to feel that someone invisible was watching them. However, the worst thing happened when one of them went into the basement and did not return. The others went to look for him, and when they found him in the corner, he was dead, but he had an expression on his face as if he had seen something terrible. His last words were, "There is someone there." When they returned to the surface, they saw that all the exits were blocked, and only after they started screaming did the doors open. Once they were safe, they saw something black and large disappear into the darkness.
Today, Centralia is one of the most mysterious and ominous places in the United States. And although most people have long since left, we cannot forget the history of this ghost town that was consumed by fire but never disappeared from our memory. Would you dare to visit Centralia? Are its abandoned streets still a place for those looking for an unforgettable experience? Let us know in the comments if you believe in the legends about the ghosts of Centralia. And don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss even more mystical stories from around the world.